Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Laura Murphy.
Thank you, Senator Durbin and Ranking Member Cruz, for inviting the ACLU to testify at today's hearing. For nearly 100 years, the ACLU has worked to defend and preserve the rights that the Constitution and the laws of the United States guarantee. I would especially like to thank you, Senator Durbin, for your tireless leadership as chairman. You have held hearings on a variety of critical issues, from solitary confinement to racial profiling and addressing barriers to voting, and for that, we are so very thankful. My written testimony provides an extensive and broader view of the state of civil and human rights, but today I will focus my remarks on 3 areas of unfinished business. 1, the militarization of police, 2, sentencing reform, and 3, criminal disenfranchisement in voting. We are standing at a crossroads in America right now. One must only look to the current crises in Ferguson, in New York City, and in Cleveland to see that extreme problems in policing continue. With recent police paramilitary tactics splashed across our TV screens, we must ask ourselves, do we want an America where the exercise of First Amendment rights is met by assault weapons and tear gas, where armored vehicles are used in our day-to-day policing, where policing resembles our military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, where communities of color are disproportionately under siege? If the answer to these questions is no, Congress must act immediately. Militarized policing goes far beyond Ferguson. Although SWAT teams were originally created to deal with life or death emergencies like hostage crises, they are now overwhelmingly used to serve search warrants in drug investigations. A recent ACLU report found that SWAT teams were used 79% of the time for raiding a person's home, most often for drugs. Such tactics are unnecessary and excessive. What message are we sending by using weapons of war to police American communities? Congress must ensure accountability. Federal funding and providing military equipment should be conditioned on data collection, use of body-worn cameras, anti-racial profiling training, and insistence on community policing, as my good friend has pointed out. The war on drugs has created an incarceration nation with too many people in prison for too long, serving no useful benefit to society. One of the major reasons for expanded jail and prison populations over the past 30 years is the use of stiff mandatory minimum sentencing for nonviolent offenses. Prison costs now absorb nearly a third of DOJ's discretionary budget, 30%. The costs, though, go far beyond simply the money it takes to incarcerate over 2.3 million people. The true costs are human lives, mainly of generations of young Black and Latino men and women who serve long prison sentences and are lost to their families and communities. Organizations across the political spectrum support truly bipartisan sentencing reform, such as the Smarter Sentencing Act, and we thank you for that. That act would address the ongoing crisis in our federal prisons by reducing the prison population. The SSA is sponsored by Senators Durbin, Lee, Leahy, Cruz, and Representatives Bobby Scott and Raul Labrador. The bill also has considerable conservative support. The time is now to pass the Smarter Sentencing Act. It's only a first step in reducing over-incarceration. There's another tragic outcome of our nation's incarceration binge. Almost 6 million of our citizens have lost the right to vote because of a past criminal conviction, in many instances for very low-level crimes. Upon release from prison, these citizens work, they pay taxes, they live in our communities, and they raise families. But millions cannot vote. 1 out of every 13 African Americans of voting age has lost the right to vote. That is 4 times the national average. But millions have no input on our political process. That is unacceptable. We commend Senators Ben Cardin and Rand Paul for their leadership in this area, and we urge the passage of the Democracy Restoration Act, a bill that would restore voting rights in federal elections to millions of citizens. Ending discrimination should be, and historically has been, a bipartisan issue. Just consider the multiple Voting Rights Act extensions that we've had. Consider the laudatory Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. These would not have happened without bipartisan support. Only with bipartisan support can we make much-needed changes to our criminal justice policies. And I'm sorry Senator Cruz had to leave, because we would like to work with him as well on changing our criminal justice policies. We look forward to working with him as the new chair and all members of this subcommittee in the 114th Congress on these critical issues. I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to testify. And before I end, I would ask special consideration before the hearing record is closed. I would like to ask if the ACLU may submit a document outlining some of the gender-related problems in our criminal justice system.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Mr. Henderson, there was a time when witnesses came before this subcommittee and told us about what had happened when we had the 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Over a span of 20 years or more, there was a massive incarceration of African Americans, unjustly, unfairly, for undue long periods of time. But there was another reaction. The African American community understood it. And as a consequence, when many of these same people were called to serve on juries to try people for drug crimes, they remembered. And it became increasingly difficult for prosecutors in some areas to win a prosecution before a jury that was integrated. They told us that story, and it was understandable. Let me take that to what I think we currently face, at least in some communities that I'm aware of. We have seen a decline in violent crime in the city of Chicago, but still too many violent crimes. The majority, the overwhelming majority, are black-on-black crimes. When you visit the communities that are the most dangerous, where the children are in the most danger, going back and forth to school, even playing, sitting on a porch, you find a reaction from people in the community that they don't reach out to the police, they don't cooperate with the police, they fear the drug gangs and those who own the guns, but they fear reaching out to the police is going to be just as dangerous or unproductive. 2 areas of nullification, but one that has a direct negative impact on the people living there. Tell me how you react to that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it is a terrific question, and I think you have correctly pointed out some of the challenges that law enforcement and the communities that they are paid to protect often encounter in their relationship with one another. The relationship between law enforcement and the African American community, as Senator Booker helped lay out in his presentation, has a long history based on fundamental injustices that our country has yet to fully overcome. And you correctly point out that obviously communities experiencing crime, regardless of the makeup and color of that community, needs the protection that law enforcement provides. On the other hand, when law enforcement is applied inconsistently, unfairly, without equal protection, and often without respect for the lives of the individuals that law enforcement is charged to protect, you develop a level of ambivalence, indeed a level of fear, that may affect how you respond to the legitimate needs of law enforcement in the engagement with the communities they serve. Now, let me say at the outset, this is not a generalized indictment of law enforcement. We know many police officers, we work with police officers, and many police officers are fully committed to protecting their charges regardless of the race of the communities they prosecute. Having said that, there are identifiable problems, some of which have surfaced in the last several weeks in the cases that we have cited, which clearly point out the need for further training and responsibility to ensure that these individuals are protected. One of the concerns that we expressed with the guidance issued by the Department of Justice is that it didn't go far enough to require state and local police officers not engaged in direct federal law enforcement activity, which is covered by the guidance, but law enforcement that relies on federal support, federal dollars, federal equipment, that these departments should be required to attest under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits racial and ethnic and national origin discrimination. These departments should attest to the fact that they have training programs designed to ensure that racial profiling or profiling of the kind we've discussed that should be prohibited does not take effect, that problems of unconscious bias, which often affect police departments, can be overcome with training, that attestations of the fact that these departments have taken affirmative steps are needed. Now, to get back to your specific question about the communities that in turn are experiencing crime and are fearful about reporting those crimes to the police, representing another form of nullification, as I would say, Senator, the truth is most crime occurs in this country in communities in which inhabitants reside. So yes, there is black-on-black crime, just as there is white-on-white crime. The communities and the makeup of the community often determines that. But having said that, there is a legitimate concern on the part of many communities that reporting crime, as much as they would like to have the protection of the police officers, often invites a level of systemic abuse which they have seen in the implementation of our criminal laws and the unfairness of it all. So when we talk about incarcerating individuals for years at a time for nonviolent, drug-related criminal activity, and yet we turn to look at legal use of the same product in states like Colorado that had individuals incarcerated for long periods of time, whether it's in Illinois or Minnesota or other locations, there's obviously some sense of unfairness and injustice. And we need to try to reconcile that. And then one last point. Your effort on the Fair Sentencing Act, we've talked about it here. But the truth is, had you not shown the kind of leadership that you demonstrated, your willingness to reach out to Senator Sessions, your willingness to cut a deal, and we talked with you at that time. We obviously were pleased that the 100-to-1 disparity was being changed. We had hoped that the disparity would have been eliminated entirely, that there would have been a 1-to-1 ratio of incarceration based on crack or powder cocaine. Nonetheless, the change that the two of you helped usher in and was approved by the Senate has led to a substantial reduction in prison time for individuals who would have been adversely affected, on average about 3 years. The cost factors involved in the incarceration of these individuals and the impact that returning to their communities at an earlier point in time has had on the overall nature of the community is beyond price and compare. You should be very proud of what you've been able to accomplish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henderson. Senator Franken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, there's so much here. You know, this is a moment, I think, in this country that, you know, our first witnesses and all of you have talked about how Ferguson, Staten Island, and Cleveland are not anomalies. But there's a focus now in this country. And this is a moment, it's a moment that I think we really need to, at the very least, try to grapple with this, try to focus on it, and try to legislate. I heard from a friend who I hadn't heard from in 20 years after this. After Senator Booker spoke, and you heard how powerfully he spoke today, he spoke at our caucus lunch. And that same evening, I got an email from a friend I hadn't seen in 20 years who said, you have to do something about this. I have conversations with my 15-year-old son that are very uncomfortable, just like Senator Booker talked about what it's like for a young African-American male, that there's no margin for error in dealing with law enforcement. I want to ask Dr. Alexander, you talked about community policing, and I think, and it sounds to me that, I think what you were saying, Mr. Henderson, I believe, was that that when there's not federal crime involved, there's still federal funding involved.
Right.
And can we require some kind of protocol in community policing? And let me ask you something, because this is the difference between Ferguson and Staten Island, I think, is that Ferguson, the police department really did not represent the community in its makeup. And I think in New York it does more. And this is for anyone on the panel, but maybe Dr. Alexander first. What does that say about training versus, or in league with, having the police department represent the community?
Well, it's important, Senator. As we all know, diversity is a very important concept I think we all tend to pay very close attention to, and one in this nation that I would hope, whether it's government or private industry, we all make some attempt to rectify, particularly when we see agencies as such that may be lacking in that area. Diversity is hugely important. There are many departments across this country who are doing it very well every day, and there are some communities in this country, Senator, that struggle with the whole concept of diversity. Some of it may be deliberate, or they don't take it that serious, and then in some cases you will have communities such as Ferguson, where I had the opportunity to spend some time with the chief there on a number of occasions, and we talked about diversification in his department, and we'll use Ferguson as an example. That's a community where the demographics in that city changed from white to black over about a 20-year span. I mean, changed hugely. In that transition, the department, the police department itself, did not transition to look more like that community. Now, in all fairness to Chief Jackson, he made attempts, as he stated to me, to diversify that department. One of the biggest challenges that he had is, in as much as he wanted to make that department more representative of that community, he struggled with the fact that the same population that he was trying to recruit, every other police department in his area was trying to recruit as well, too. For an example, St. Louis PD Police Department, St. Louis County Police Department. A lot of these officers of color tend to go to larger agencies with paid more money and more opportunity for advancements. And then you also had himself and others competing for that same population as well, even in private industry. But one thing that I concluded, and I made very clear to him, and I talked to a number of my chief and police administrative colleagues across this country, regardless of what that challenge may be to you, we can no longer accept the fact we can't find any. That is no longer acceptable. What it means, Senator, is that departments that struggle with recruitment of people of color, they're going to have to work harder. They're going to have to put They're going to have to go outside their communities to recruit, and they may even have to develop within their communities, within their local public schools, pipelines where children and young people can become police explorers. And you begin to groom those young people very early on in their educational process, so that maybe at some point they become a pipeline into your police agency. It is a challenge in some parts of the country. Where I come from, in DeKalb County, Georgia, Metro Atlanta, I don't have a problem recruiting people of color. I don't have that issue. But here again, it depends on where you are. But one thing I will not accept is the fact I can't find people of color. It just means we have to become more creative, and we have to become more determined, and we have to look around as well, too, and see how other departments or other industries are recruiting, because we may not have to recreate that wheel, but accepting the fact that we cannot find people of color is not acceptable, because a community deserves to look like the government that serves it. And whatever that government is that serves that community, there should be some similarities there as well, too. But I can say this, is that there are a number of departments out there across this country, police departments across this country, who really make dedicated efforts, who really work hard to diversify their agency, not only at the lower ranks, but all the way up to the top. And we have to applaud those. But there are agencies out there as well, too, that struggle. And some struggle because they don't have any control over that, and others struggle maybe because they don't see the benefit in it. And we have to hold those agencies, whoever they are out there, we have to hold them accountable.
I would ask that the senators and members of Congress be creative in attaching conditions to federal funds to local police departments. We had the Hyde Amendment many years ago, which is still in force, which said no federal funds shall be used for abortion. Why are federal funds being used for racial profiling? That's, in fact, what is happening now. We believe the President has the authority under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to require local police departments receiving federal funds not to discriminate. And there's a debate in the Justice Department. And so many people in the Justice Department said, oh, we can't have any jurisdiction over local police. But millions of dollars flow into over 85% of local police departments. And I think this should be an amendment strategy or a conversation with the President. But it is important for Congress to act, because what's going on in communities of color is just so horrible when it comes to community and police relations. Something has to be done. And I just want to say that Attorney General Eric Holder, I think, gets this. And his staff is working on burn JAG grants. And that flows a lot of money into police departments. They say that Congress has a great deal of authority over those programs. So I would ask members of this committee to look at the COPS program, to look at burn JAG grants, and to see what restrictions can be enacted so that federal funds are not used in a discriminatory fashion.
Senator Franken, can I just add one point to your last question, which you touched on? I'm sorry.
Sure,
Thank you.
sure.
I apologize. Thank you. You touched on the non-indictment of Eric Garner in New York, and you talked about the police department being more representative of the community. Indeed, it is. But yesterday, Attorney General Eric Schneiderman of New York issued a request to Governor Cuomo, which we supported, by the way, asking that in instances where police shootings involving civilians occurred, that a special prosecutor be appointed to conduct the inquiry and to handle the indictment process. We believe that that's necessary. Police departments have an inherent conflict of interest with local prosecutors. That is not to say that they have teamed up to avoid the indictment of police officers. It is to say that the special relationship that prosecutors enjoy with police After all, they depend upon police to provide information and often testimony in cases that they handle. You can't handle a police shooting of a civilian in an impartial way without bringing in a prosecutor from the outside. So when we look at the situation in Staten Island, when we look at the situation in Ferguson, in the Ferguson circumstance, the outcome was virtually foretold at the moment that the prosecutor elected not to recuse himself over the requests of local individuals, and his record suggested that this outcome was predictable. It's not that way in every circumstance, but certainly it is enough of a concern that the approach that Attorney General Schneiderman took is one that we would recommend broadly.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Senator Franken. Senator Blumenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you to each of you for being here and for your extraordinary work over many, many years. And I want to just go from the last remark that you made, Mr. Henderson, because I think that the lack of an indictment in the Garner case has certainly shocked and appalled countless people and led to the kind of suggestions that State Attorney General Schneiderman made. I'm not sure that the federal government would have authority to require a special state prosecutor to prosecute a local or state policeman, but I think the suggestion certainly is one that has attracted a lot of support, and understandably and rightly so. I appreciate all of you raising the sentencing issue. I'm a co-sponsor of the Smarter Sentencing Act, which was introduced by our chairman, Senator Durbin, and Senator Lee. And I know as a former prosecutor how important discretion is and how restricting discretion, most particularly in sentencing, can impede justice and fairness and also be against the interests of society. And I also have called for stronger oversight as to the use of military equipment. Right now, as you probably know, there really is no, in effect, collection of data as to what is dispensed by the Department of Justice, where it goes, what it's used for. There's essentially no accountability by either the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice, and I think one or the other has to impose some accountability. And I want to say in preface to the question I'm going to ask that I have great respect for police and prosecutors around the country. I have worked in law enforcement for the better part of 40 years, beginning in 1977 as the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut and then as the State Attorney General. I think that there has been tremendous progress in the quality of our policing community at state, local, and federal levels, in the quality of training, the quality of people, and practices, and even diversity over these years, which in no way minimizes the progress that we still have to make. I respect the jobs they have to do day in and day out, facing extraordinary dangers and life and death decisions that have to be made sometimes instantaneously. But I do think that we all benefit by better information. And right now, I think a lot of folks have come to realize that there is essentially no information about the deaths that occur while individuals are in custody or under arrest. I've introduced legislation in the Senate called the Death in Custody Reporting Act. It's a companion bill to Representative Bobby Scott's bill, which passed the House by a voice vote, and passed this committee earlier this year. It's a pretty simple piece of legislation. It requires states to report how many individuals die each year while they're in custody or during the course of an arrest. The stark, staggering fact is we don't know. And I'm going to ask that two recent articles be entered in the record. One is from the Post, the Washington Post, of September 8th, and it's entitled, "How Many Police Shootings a Year? No One Knows." The second is from the Wall Street Journal of December 3rd. It's entitled, "Hundreds of Police Killings Are Uncounted in Federal Stats." The Washington Post article essentially says that we know that there are a lot of police shootings, but they're all self-reported. There's no requirement that they be reported. And again, that is in no way to indicate disrespect for the decisions that are made in those individual instances by 17,000 law enforcement agencies, but the fact is only 750 of them report shootings. We know the number of police who are shot. We know a vast variety of statistics about what is happening on farms, in cities, but we don't know the number of people, including justifiable homicides, as they're called, that happen on our streets and in our police departments. So I hope that, and by the way, Mr. Chairman, I'd like for these to be entered in the record if there's no objection, these two articles. I hope that you will indicate your support for this legislation. I think it would be meaningful to have your opinion, and would ask you simply whether you feel this kind of legislation would make sense.
Well, if you mind if I start, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Alexander, I'm happy to have you start, and then I would ask, Mr. Chairman, that each of the other witnesses be given an opportunity to respond as well.
Yes, sir. I'm in total support of that. I think it's, part of what we're experiencing across this country right now is a failure by many Americans, not just African Americans, but Americans across this country, feel a total disconnect from their criminal justice system. In light of the Michael Brown shooting, Eric Gardner case, it has become more pronounced. I think people who are not African American, people who did not have that experience being African American or color in this country, are beginning to see clearly that something is wrong in our criminal justice system, not just police, but our entire criminal justice system across the board, 360 degrees. And in regards to what you're speaking to, sir, I find it unfortunate and embarrassing as a law enforcement official that there is not any federal legislation that requires that cities, states, tribal communities, villages, all across this great nation are not reporting those types of shootings and deaths to a federal authority, because they need to be reported, they need to be investigated, they need to be studied scientifically, and develop some evidence-based material that might be helpful in identifying a trend in which right now we're just all kind of anecdotally looking at. So I certainly support that as the president of Noble, and I would hope that the rest of this country would support it as well too, because as a sophisticated country as we are, and the leaders of the world, we have a responsibility in this nation where we have people who are now protesting in the streets from Berkeley to Maine, and from South Florida to Detroit, all across this nation and around the world. We need to take more accountability. We need to begin to close some of those gaps and expose ourselves and become much more transparent to the American people in terms of criminal justice system and how we do business, because that is the biggest piece that angers people in Ferguson, in Staten Island, in the rest of this nation. There's absolutely no sense of transparency. There's a loss of trust and commitment, not just from police, but from the entire criminal justice community. And we're a better nation in that, and we have to move towards some real reform, sir.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Ms. Murphy?
Yes, we support the Death in Custody Act, and we hope that the Senate can take it up before the end of the lame duck session. But, data collection is key. We were making momentum after the Rodney King shooting in Congress. First, the ACLU helped write the Traffic Stop Statistics Act, because we had documented in a report that we called Driving While Black, how many times black motorists were pulled over by state and federal police. There was no data there. But then the problem expanded to stop and frisk and street interactions, and we didn't have data there. So we worked on the End Racial Profiling Act, which would require data collection as a key element. And we think without the data, it's hard to make real reform, because we need to know where the problem is, how long it's been going on, who's doing, which departments are having the most difficult encounters, and the fact that this information is not collected by the federal government is just a travesty. So data collection is crucial to any kind of criminal justice reform, especially getting to the issue of racial profiling.
Senator, my colleagues have elaborated quite clearly on the value of the Death in Custody Act. The Leadership Conference is a big supporter of the bill. And like Ms. Murphy, we are hopeful that the Senate will act on this initiative before it adjourns sine die. That gives us just a few days. But it's such a basic, fundamental piece of legislation. The data collection is essential, and that's all the bill would do. So for that reason, we hope that it can get the kind of bipartisan support here that it was able to obtain in the House, and we hope the bill becomes law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for convening this hearing today. And I'd like to thank the panel for your compelling testimony and for your answers to the many questions posed here. Like my colleagues, and certainly the leadership of Senator Durbin's been outstanding on this. I am a co-sponsor and a supporter of the Smarter Sentencing Act that he and Senator Lee have advanced, and of the Death in Custody bill that was just discussed by Senator Blumenthal. So let me, rather than repeating a lot of topics that have already been covered, simply ask for your input on two different questions that are related. First, I too find it shocking we don't have reliable statistics. I, like many of my colleagues, worked closely with and respect law enforcement and the difficult and dangerous jobs that they do. But for us to simply have no data, no meaningful data on deaths in law enforcement incidents, to me is deeply puzzling, frustrating, concerning, and something we need to step forward and take some responsibility for and act to address. So first, why do so many departments refuse to collect and report reliable statistics, and why can't we get stronger bipartisan action on that? First. Second, we have an undeniably unequal impact on communities of color in this country from our criminal justice system. Just in my home state of Delaware, which is roughly 22% African American, 42% of arrests, 64% of the prison population, 86% of those who are arrested for drug use. There's an undeniably disparate impact on communities of color, and there are several different ways we could also have broken that out. The cost, both the lifetime cost, the moral cost, the fiscal cost on African American men in particular, as my colleague Senator Booker, I think, detailed earlier, is overwhelming. I choose to be encouraged that there are bipartisan bills that I hope this Congress will consider and take up now and in the next Congress. But what can we do to reduce and eliminate the unfair toll that our criminal justice system takes on minority communities? And I'd be grateful if the panel would answer each of those two questions to the extent you feel inclined in the time we have remaining. Thank you.
I'll start, Senator Coons, and I'll be very brief. First, again, I want to reiterate a point that both I and Laura Murphy have made about using Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to condition the receipt of federal funds on a commitment of non-discrimination and providing the affirmative training necessary to ensure that that commitment can be carried out. I believe, and I think many of us believe, that the departments that receive federal funds, over 85% of the police departments in the country today, do not begin with an affirmative decision to discriminate against their citizens. These are police departments with officers that are committed to fair treatment, I think, for all. Having said that, however, there are certain systemic factors that enter into the equation that make the kind of biased policing that we have seen almost inevitable. Stereotypes, misperceptions about activity the assumption that one community is more dependent on drug use than another, when in fact the statistics would suggest that almost equanimity in the way in which drugs are used. All those are factors. So data collection is important, training is important, and encouraging affirmative behavior by using a statute that is over 50 years old. In our view, it makes common sense, and we hope that that can be encouraged. I guess I would make one other point. The Smarter Sentencing Act is an incredibly valuable tool, and it's often framed in moral terms as a way of addressing this disparity that exists in sentencing, and indeed it is a moral issue. But there is another very practical factor that makes this such an important initiative. The Department of Justice will tell you that the Bureau of Prisons, which it administers, is currently eating up about 40% of the department's budget, with that number growing annually because of the mass incarceration that our government supports. The growth of the federal budget, the Department of Justice budget, and being consumed by the Bureau of Prisons means that other discretionary programs that are so important to the communities in which our federal officers are deployed can't be administered effectively with that rate of growth in the Bureau of Prisons. And we're hoping that those statistics will help encourage members to look at this. And then lastly, the President has initiated, as you know, a program called My Brother's Keeper. It has spawned a private initiative called the Boys and Men of Color Initiative. When it was initially proposed, there were some who seemed skeptical about the value of that program. However, looking at the events of recent weeks and months, with the killing of young boys and men by police officers and the attendant economic circumstances that feed into that problem, one would hope that the President's initiative would get a second look at a measure of support, and that goes beyond the enforcement of existing federal laws in using the good offices of the President and members of Congress to encourage private engagement in these activities as well.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Dr. Alexander?
Yes, Senator, I think it becomes important to note, unfortunately, sometimes cities and states are not going to take the responsibility to collect data. And it becomes, for me, I think at that point, a federal issue where legislation needs to be imposed so that we can begin to direct communities to impart with all of us, publicly and privately, any information, particularly around in-custody deaths. And I would even go beyond that and say severe injuries as well, too. Because if there are reoccurrences, or if there's a threshold that is met that brings about a certain amount of pause, I think that gives an opportunity for all of us to begin to look at those agencies. And sometimes it may not be without ill intent. It may just be because of poor training or a lack of internal policies that dictates that certain procedures need to take place. Oftentimes what I have found over the years, and I've been in this business a very long time now, is that many of our police officers out there who are doing this job every day across this country are doing a great job. That's the greatest majority of them. And sometimes along the way, being that policing is not an exact science, sometimes they get it wrong. Not intentionally, but sometimes they do. But the difference is this, though, is life and death. And when death is experienced, then it comes to light, and then people start asking questions across this country and those communities, and oftentimes there are no answers. That is one of the biggest problems that is happening today. There is no answers. There's a feeling of no transparency whatsoever. And where truth is not seen or experienced or felt by people emotionally, what we end up with is just what we're experiencing today. Because the questions you're asking, Senator, is really age-old questions, and questions we've talked about or danced around before, but we've never drawn any conclusion to. We're at a place now in this nation's history that we're going to have to begin to answer these questions. We're going to have to explore, Mr. Chairman, reasons and ways in which we're going to change and look at this criminal justice system in a very different kind of way, because it is not the same for all people. Sometimes it's based on race, Sometimes it's based on gender. Sometimes it's based on what your economic class may happen to be, all the above plus some more. But we got to change this, because this is just not what we're experiencing every night in this country now is no longer just a fashionable thing, if you will. It's not just a reaction. We're seeing what is evolving into a movement. It's like we saw the civil rights movement in the 60s. It's evolving into a movement because all people across this nation, if you look at Berkeley, California, you look at the demographics of that community, both economically and race, thousands of people who are marching out there every night. And some will say that that group is also made up of anarchists, and it may be. But I can pretty much assure you as well, too, that a great number of people that are marching across this country every night are just American citizens who are saying, we want to see something different. We need to, our whole criminal justice system needs to be explored and possibly revamped. Now, that's a heavy lift. We understand that. But what we have to right now engender in the rest of this country is a sense of hope that someone is looking at this, someone is paying attention, someone is hearing them, and something different is going to happen, because the American people, in my estimation, are just not going to accept this as just being another incident, because they've been too frequent, and they've been, I should say, if you look at the overall incidents in each one of these cases, what you will constantly find is that young African Americans confronting police officers who are oftentimes very different from them in race and in economic status. There's a disconnect in this country, not just in policing, but there's a disconnect across the whole criminal justice system. Even the grand jury process needs to be explored. Because when you have communities in this nation who no longer trust law enforcement, when you have people in this nation who tell their children that they should be afraid of the police, and they're afraid for their children to go outside because they may be harmed by the police, that is a bad place that we're in this country. And we need to acknowledge it, and we need to begin to do something about it. But I have to be perfectly honest with you. I am tired of people talking to me about it. We truly have to figure out some strategies, some new strategies, and maybe do some things in this country we have never tried before. But we got to take some risks to do something very different than just the same rhetoric that we can constantly give back to people in this country, because they're not accepting it any longer. And I'm not going to give it to them any longer. Back in my community, my whole idea is to help create some strategies, some change, so that community and police and the criminal justice system work well together. A safer community, a safer America. This is not a separated states of America. This is a United States of America. And part of our whole criminal justice system is based on the fact of equality for everyone. And when we can reach that goal, and it may not become attainable in my lifetime, but we have to get on that trajectory, and we got to find a way to get there. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get there, and I think we all are. But it's something that has to be addressed today, sir, and thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Ms. Murphy,
Yes.
conclude.
It's always interesting being the only woman at a hearing. We represent 50% of the population, but we have to be feisty in order to be heard. So I appreciate my male colleagues, but I think there are a number of questions that I'd like to address. And if I'm not able to address them in the oral part of the hearing, I would like to be able to submit answers to you for the record. But I think your specific question about why we can't get to data collection goes back to the Fraternal Order of Police. They oppose the Traffic Stop Statistics Act. They oppose the End Racial Profiling Act. And what we need is a convening of police unions and civil rights leaders, maybe at the initiation of you, Senator Coons, or you, Senator Durbin, because they feel, and members of the FOP have told me, that if data is collected, it will be used to punish them. And we're not out to punish the police. We're out to end discrimination. And I think that the police have to be brought into these discussions, and the unions have to be brought into these discussions, because they are the people who many members of Congress rely on for political endorsements. And so they have a greater power in some cases than many of our organizations that do not have political action committees. And I still think that there's this lingering fear that many elected officials have of looking soft on crime. And so we have not policed the police as vigorously as we could or should. But I think now's a moment. We've got to use this moment. If it doesn't happen now, it's not going to happen.
Well, thank you, Ms. Murphy, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging a full answer by the whole committee to my questions, the whole panel of witnesses. It is, to summarize, my hope, too, that in a period when a lack of answers, a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability has led many to protest not just the perception but the reality of a disconnection between our communities and those charged with the important duty of keeping us safe, but doing so within our constitutional order. It is my real hope that we will take action, and action that leads to change, that leads to hope. But I am clear that without the sort of action you, Mr. Chairman, have led in leading this bipartisan bill, we won't make progress. So thank you for your leadership in convening this and for everything you're doing, and we hope to do together ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Coons. I'd like to just do maybe one or two follow-up questions. Ms. Murphy, when I first saw that armored personnel carrier in Ferguson, Missouri, I thought, what in the world is going on here? I didn't know police departments had that kind of equipment. I assume maybe the most elite, biggest city, terrorist threat type of situations. But Ferguson, Missouri? And crossed my mind several questions. What in the world are they doing parading that out at what appeared to be, at the moment, a much different kind of street demonstration? Secondly, what are we doing as a federal government peddling this kind of hardware? Third, is this just the product of some swaggering, chest-thumping chief of police and procurement officer that want to have the newest and biggest and toughest-looking vehicles? But then another question kind of came to me. Don't we live in a country where people are fighting for the right of individual citizens to own military assault weapons? And aren't we asking these police to keep communities safe where those citizens might live? It seems to me that there's an interesting conversation that needs to take place here. I don't want to see armored personnel carriers in every police department in my state by any means. But I also want to be cognizant of the fact that our police are facing weaponry that we are blessing here at some levels, and you've even heard it today in this committee, that go way beyond the threats that policemen historically faced. And I want to be sensitive to that. So how do you respond?
I want to be sensitive to that, too. But if you look at the usage of these armored vehicles, these helicopters, these bazookas, these M16s, they are used for routine law enforcement.
Which makes no sense.
Which makes absolutely no sense. Now, if they were used to fight terrorism or armed robbery, bank robberies, or hostage situations, then it makes more sense. And it's so racially biased the way this equipment is being used. When there's a hostage crisis in the white community, you will see the armored vehicles. But when there's a routine protest or drug arrest in the black community, you will see these vehicles and more. Plus, we are rewarding people like Sheriff Arpaio, who has a boatload of weaponry that he claims he needs in order to enforce our immigration laws.
Let's let the police organization respond.
Thank you, Chairman. I certainly do appreciate what my colleague, Ms. Murphy, is saying, and certainly do understand her perception, and I'm quite sure in conversations that she have had with many citizens in her community across the country. But let me say this as a 37-year veteran in policing, where I've spent all my career, from Miami, Florida, to Orlando, to New York, and now to DeKalb County, Georgia. The 1033 program, I think one of the failures of the program, sir, is quite frankly this. You just cannot give out this equipment to anyone who wants it. In Ferguson, New York, that equipment did not belong to the Ferguson Police Department.
Ferguson, Missouri.
That equipment belonged, if I'm not mistaken, to St. Louis County Police Department or the state police. Now, some of that equipment, maybe all of it, I can't say specifically, may have been acquired through the 1033 program, but the way in which it was utilized in Ferguson, quite frankly, in short, was wrong. All day is wrong, and many chiefs across this country have spoken out against the fact how it was used was wrong. Now, the other piece, or the other side to this, to your point, Mr. Chairman, is the fact that post 9/11, this country is still in a position where we're keeping ourselves safe. Police departments across this country are certainly being confronted with small arms and large arms that are at the pleasure of a lot of criminals that are out there. And we find situations, and certainly I've seen situations in my county in DeKalb, where we have used equipment. They're not tanks. We don't own bazookas. And sometimes I think this equipment get exaggerated because none of us have rocket launchers or bazookas. But to the common layperson, it all looks the same. I get it. It's the optics of it. But the reality of it is there are going to be times when police are going to have to respond to active shooters. If we think about situations across this country where we've had school shootings, mall shootings, movie theater shootings, we want our officers to be able to get in, find that target, and do what needs to be done to save lives of others. And the only way they're going to do that sometime is that they're going to have to be in armored equipment. The problem is not the equipment itself, it's the utilization of it. And before that heavy equipment, in my opinion, is given out, there needs to be, you need to be able to show a need for it in your community. That's number one. You need to be able to show cause and a need. And number two, you need to be held accountable to that equipment, which means that you have to have written policies which have its terms of engagement as to when you will take that equipment out and under what circumstances it would be used for. And one thing we cannot use it for is for people who are peacefully protesting in this country. We cannot do that. The optics on Ferguson was horrific, and I think it shocked many people in this country, all across this country, regardless of whether they were Democrats or Republicans or black or white, men or women. It was shocking. And we learned from it, hopefully. But what we want to be able to do is also protect our police officers, but there has to be a time and moment when that equipment is utilized. Because if I'm being held hostage in my home or in my bank when I'm making a deposit, I want the police to be able to get there and be safe in getting there so that they can secure that bank, arrest that criminal, and get me home. So there is a place for it, but it's not to be used against American people who are protesting and exercising their First Amendment right as to what we all witnessed, and which, understandably, left a bad taste in many Americans' mouths.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander, and my thanks to this panel. There has been a great deal of interest in this hearing today, and we have here a statement from Senator Leahy and statements from more than 70 different organizations wanting to be part of the record on this general overview of civil rights in America today. And since there's no one here to object, it's going to be put in the record. I want to say make two closing comments. First, I want to acknowledge Mara Silver on my staff, who has been the author of the Smarter Sentencing Act and has worked harder on it than anybody. Mara, thank you so much for what you've done. And special thanks to Joe Zogby, who 8 years ago said to me, "Senator, I think we need a subcommittee on human rights." And I said, "Joe, what would we talk about?" Well, we found a lot to talk about for 4 years, and then when we were merged into the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights Subcommittee. I'm very proud of what this subcommittee has set out to do, particularly proud of the fact that we actually created legislation that starts to address some of these issues rather than just talk about them. And that is primarily due to the guidance of Joe Zogby and the staffers who have worked with him. I thank Joe and his family here today for giving me such great service to this Judiciary Committee. There may be some follow-up questions coming your way, and if you could respond to them in a timely fashion, I would certainly appreciate that. This, as I said in my last hearing, is Subcommittee Chair for the time being, and I'm hoping that Senator Cruz or whoever succeeds me will continue in this tradition of addressing the issues of our day. Thank you for joining. This subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, sir.